38,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, and Juliana had never felt more alone. Her 9-month-old daughter, Aria, was screaming. That raw, desperate kind of cry that makes strangers stare and mothers look away. The piercing, relentless wail seemed to drill into every passenger's skull, echoing through the dimmed cabin of the red-eye flight from Rome to New York like an air raid siren that wouldn't stop. Sweat dampened Juliana's temple, trickling down the side of her face despite the cool, recycled air flowing from the overhead vent. Her hands shook as she bounced Aria against her shoulder, tried the bottle again, rocked her side to side, whispered apologies in both Italian and English. Nothing worked. The crying only got louder, more urgent, as if Aria was trying to tell her something she couldn't understand. Every passenger in rows 19 through 27 was glaring, whispering, judging. A businessman in seat 20D, still wearing his rumpled suit and loosened tie, muttered something about inconsiderate parents who shouldn't fly with babies if they can't control them. The woman in 22B kept sighing dramatically, turning in her seat to shoot pointed looks over her shoulder. An elderly couple across the aisle exchanged knowing glances that said everything their polite silence didn't. They were thinking what everyone always thought when they saw a young mother alone with a screaming infant. That she was doing it wrong. That she didn't know what she was doing. That a baby this upset clearly needed something she wasn't providing. That maybe she should have stayed home, or brought help, or figured out how to be a better mother before subjecting a plane full of paying customers to this torture. They weren't entirely wrong. 6 months ago, Juliana had been convinced she was failing at everything. 6 months ago, she had woken up to find Marco gone. No note on the pillow. No explanation. Just an empty closet, empty drawers, and a single piece of paper on the kitchen counter that read, "I can't do this. I'm not strong enough to be what you both need." The memory sent a fresh wave of shame washing over her. Juliana closed her eyes, pulled Aria closer to her chest, and whispered, "Mi dispiace, Stellina. Mama's trying. I'm so sorry, baby. Please, please stop crying." But Aria only wailed harder, her small face red and contorted, tears streaming down her cheeks, her whole body rigid with whatever distress she couldn't articulate. Juliana felt her own tears start to fall, hot and humiliating, as the weight of exhaustion and isolation pressed down on her chest like a physical force. The flight attendant was making her way down the aisle now, her practiced smile fixed firmly in place. It was that tight, professional expression that didn't reach her eyes, the smile that meant trouble was coming. Juliana had seen that smile before on other flights, directed at other struggling parents. The smile that preceded a polite but firm suggestion to take the baby to the back of the plane, away from the passengers who paid for a quiet flight and didn't sign up for this disruption. Juliana braced herself for the lecture, for the thinly veiled judgment wrapped in corporate courtesy. She was already formulating her apologies, already feeling smaller and more inadequate with each step the flight attendant took closer. That's when the man stood up. He was sitting in seat 23F, across the aisle and 1 row back in the window seat. Juliana hadn't noticed him during boarding or at any point during the flight. She had been too consumed with preparing Aria's bottle, organizing the diaper bag, trying to anticipate every possible need before takeoff. But now, as he rose to his full height in the cramped space between seats, she couldn't help but notice him. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair slightly mussed from trying to sleep against the window. His eyes were brown and deeply tired, carrying the kind of exhaustion that suggested he hadn't slept properly in months, maybe years. He wore a simple black sweater and jeans, both slightly wrinkled from travel. There was a little boy beside him in the middle seat, maybe 6 years old, fast asleep with a worn stuffed lion clutched against his chest and a blanket tucked around his small frame. The man didn't look at Juliana. He didn't ask if she needed help. He didn't offer a sympathetic smile or a word of encouragement. He simply stood, stepped into the aisle, and in 2 long strides crossed the narrow space that separated them. And then, without speaking a single word, he reached down and lifted Aria from Juliana's trembling arms. Juliana's first instinct was panic. Her hands jerked upward reflexively, her mouth opening to protest, to demand he give her daughter back, to ask what the hell he thought he was doing. Strangers didn't just take other people's babies. That wasn't how the world worked. That wasn't safe or normal or acceptable by any measure of social convention. But something in his movements stopped her. There was a practiced confidence in the way his large hands supported Arya's head and back, a gentle authority in the way he drew her against his chest that spoke of experience rather than arrogance. His touch was careful, sure, the touch of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The cabin held its breath. Time seemed to stop, the way it does in moments of complete unreality, when the normal rules of the world suspend themselves and anything becomes possible. Every passenger who had been glaring moments before now stared in stunned disbelief. The businessman's irritated expression shifted to something between shock and curiosity. The sighing woman stopped mid-exhale, her mouth slightly open. Even the flight attendant froze in the middle of the aisle, her rehearsed intervention dying unspoken on her lips. The man cradled Arya against his chest, one large hand supporting her head, his other hand gently patting her back in a slow, rhythmic pattern. He began to sway from side to side, a subtle rocking motion that looked as natural as breathing, and then he started to hum. Low and soft, barely audible over the constant drone of the aircraft engines, a melody that sounded like something ancient and sacred, something between a prayer and a promise. Then he began to sing, his voice quiet but clear, the words in Italian, but the dialect distinctly Neapolitan, rougher and warmer than the standard Italian Giuliana had grown up speaking in Rome. Effe la nana, nella braccia della mamma. The old lullaby drifted through the silent cabin like smoke, weaving around the rows of seats, touching something primal and universal that transcended language and culture and the arbitrary boundaries people draw between strangers. And then, impossibly, miraculously, Arya stopped crying. Not gradually, with the fits and starts of a baby winding down from a tantrum. Not with hiccuping sobs that slowly fade into whimpers. All at once, as if someone had flipped a switch inside her small body, she let out one last shuddering sob and then went completely still. Arya nestled her face into the stranger's neck, her tiny fingers curling around the soft fabric of his black sweater, holding on as if she had finally found something she had been searching for all along. Her breathing shifted from panicked gasps to slow, deep pulls of air. Her rigid little body relaxed, melting against his chest with the complete trust that only babies possess. The silence was deafening. Passengers who had been ready to demand the crying stop now sat frozen, witnesses to something they couldn't quite explain. The businessman slowly closed his laptop. The woman in front turned fully around in her seat, no longer glaring, but watching with an expression of wonder. Even the elderly couple leaned into the aisle to see what had happened. Juliana watched, unable to speak, unable to think, unable to process what was happening. This stranger, this man who hadn't asked permission, who hadn't introduced himself or offered explanation, was holding her daughter like she was the most precious thing in the world. And Arya, who had screamed for 3 straight hours, who wouldn't come for her own mother no matter what Juliana tried, was finally, blessedly quiet. The man's eyes were closed as he swayed, still humming the lullaby under his breath, his cheek resting lightly against the top of Arya's head. His expression was peaceful but distant, as if he was somewhere else entirely, lost in a memory that existed beyond this plane, beyond this moment. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, he opened his eyes and looked directly at Juliana. They were dark brown, almost black in the dim cabin lighting, and they held a recognition that Juliana didn't understand. Not sympathy exactly, though there was kindness there. Not pity, though she could see he understood her exhaustion. Something deeper. Something that suggested he knew exactly what she was feeling because he had felt it himself. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and gentle, carrying the faint melody of an Italian accent that had been softened by years of living somewhere else. Somewhere that had rounded the hard consonants and lengthened the vowels into something that belonged to neither Italy nor America but existed in the space between. She just needed to be held by someone who understood. The words were simple, but they hit Juliana with the force of a revelation. Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, thick with tears she was fighting to control. Understood what? The man looked down at Arya, still sleeping peacefully against his shoulder, then back at Juliana. What it means to carry everything alone. The statement landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from Juliana's lungs. How could this stranger possibly know? How could he see the weight she had been carrying since Marco walked out 6 months ago, leaving nothing but an empty apartment and a note that blamed his weakness, but felt like an indictment of her failure? How could he recognize the crushing isolation of solo parenting in a country where she had no family, no support system, No one to call at 3 in the morning when she couldn't stop crying and Arya wouldn't stop screaming. Before Juliana could formulate a response, a small, sleepy voice piped up from across the aisle. "Papa, is the baby okay now?" Juliana looked past the man to see the little boy sitting up in seat 23F, rubbing his eyes with one small fist while clutching the stuffed lion with the other. He had the same dark hair as the man, the same warm brown eyes, but his face still held the soft roundness of early childhood. He was looking at Arya with an expression of genuine concern, his eyebrows drawn together in a miniature version of his father's concentrated focus. "She's okay now, Luca," the man said softly, his voice taking on a different quality when he addressed his son, something warmer and more tender. "She just needed a little help." He turned back to Juliana, and for the first time since this surreal interaction began, he offered a small, tired smile that created faint lines at the corners of his eyes. "I'm Matteo. That's my son, Luca. And I apologize for the unconventional introduction. But I recognized that cry." "Recognized it?" Juliana managed, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, still trying to make sense of what was happening. "The sound of a baby who knows her mama is at the end of her rope," Matteo said, glancing down at Arya again with an expression that was almost wistful. "Sometimes they just need to be held by someone who still has a little strength left to give. They can sense when we're running on empty. My wife used to say they cry harder because they're scared we'll disappear." The words "my wife" hung in the air between them, and Juliana caught the past tense immediately. She noticed the shadow that crossed Matteo's face when he said it, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the way Luca's expression dimmed slightly even though the boy probably didn't fully understand the conversation. "I'm Juliana," she said quietly, her voice still shaky but steadier than it had been moments ago. "And this is Arya. And I don't know how to thank you. I've been trying for 3 hours to get her to stop crying and nothing worked, and I thought I was going to lose my mind or get thrown off the plane or both." "No thanks needed," Matteo replied, his thumb unconsciously tracing small circles on Arya's back in a gesture so practiced it seemed automatic. "But if you'd like, I can hold her while you rest. You look like you haven't slept in days." "Try months," Juliana admitted before she could stop herself, the confession slipping out in a moment of vulnerability born from exhaustion and relief and the strange intimacy of this impossible situation. "I can't remember the last time I slept more than 2 hours in a row." Matteo's expression softened with understanding. "Then we have something in common. Mind if I sit?" He gestured to the empty middle seat beside Juliana, seat 23D, which she had specifically booked hoping to have extra space for Arya's carrier and diaper bag, and all the supplies she had convinced herself she needed to survive a transatlantic flight alone with an infant. Juliana nodded, unable to form words, and watched as Matteo carefully settled into the seat. He moved slowly, deliberately, maintaining the gentle swaying motion even as he sat down, never disturbing Arya's sleep. His body seemed to instinctively adjust to accommodate the baby's comfort, angling his shoulder to support her head, keeping his breathing deep and even, continuing the soft humming under his breath. The flight attendant, who had been standing frozen in the aisle this entire time, finally seemed to recover from her shock. She opened her mouth as if to say something about passenger seating arrangements or safety regulations or whatever script she was supposed to follow, but then she simply closed it again, apparently deciding that whatever rule Matteo had just broken, the peaceful result was worth ignoring. She retreated back toward the galley without a word, though Juliana caught the small, approving smile on her face as she turned away. Luca unbuckled his seatbelt and climbed carefully over the armrest into the aisle, the stuffed lion still tucked securely under one arm. He crossed to his father's original seat and settled into the window spot, kneeling on the cushion so he could peer across the narrow aisle at the baby with wide, curious eyes. "She's really little," Luca whispered, trying to keep his voice down but lacking the volume control of older children. "Smaller than I remember being." Matteo smiled, the expression transforming his tired face into something younger, lighter. "You were exactly this little once, Figlio. You fit in one of my hands when you were born. Your mama used to sing this same song to you every night before bed." The word mama carried the same weight as my wife had moments before. Grief and love and history all wrapped up in 2 syllables. Luca's expression grew serious, thoughtful in the way children get when they're remembering someone important who isn't there anymore. Juliana felt it in her bones, that recognition of shared loss. She didn't know Matteo's story yet, didn't know the details or the timeline or the circumstances, but she knew that tone. She lived with it every day since Marco abandoned them. Since her mother's worried voice on weekly phone calls from Rome became her only consistent adult conversation. Since she realized she was truly, completely, impossibly alone in a city of 8 million people. How did you know? Juliana asked quietly, the question encompassing so much more than just the immediate situation. How did you know what to do when I couldn't figure it out? I'm her mother. I should know how to comfort my own daughter. Matteo turned to look at her fully, and in his eyes she saw 18 months of survival etched in the fine lines around his eyes, in the slight gray at his temples that seemed too premature for someone who couldn't be older than his mid-30s, in the set of his shoulders that suggested he had been carrying weight for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Because I've been exactly where you are, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear over the ambient noise of the aircraft. And someone once told me that the only way through is together. That we weren't meant to do this alone, no matter how much we convince ourselves we have to. But we are alone, Juliana whispered, the truth of it burning in her throat. We don't have a choice. Not anymore, Matteo said, and something in his tone shifted, became more certain. Right now, in this moment, you're not alone. I'm here. Luca is here. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes we just need to borrow someone else's strength until we find our own again. Juliana looked at her daughter, sleeping peacefully in this stranger's arms, more settled than she had been in weeks. She looked at Luca, watching them with open curiosity and innocent acceptance. She looked at Matteo, this man who had violated every social norm by taking her baby without asking, but had somehow known exactly what Arya needed when her own mother couldn't provide it. And for the first time in 6 months, since the morning she woke up to an empty apartment and a note that shattered her world, Juliana felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But maybe the possibility of hope. The recognition that she didn't have to carry everything alone, even if just for the duration of this flight. Thank you, she said again, and this time the words carried the weight of everything she couldn't articulate. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for not judging. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for staying when you could have looked away like everyone else. Matteo simply nodded, his hand still tracing those gentle circles on Arya's back, and for the first time in 3 hours, Juliana allowed herself to breathe. The cabin around them had returned to darkness, most passengers drifting back to sleep now that peace had been restored. Only the soft hum of the engines and the occasional overhead reading light broke the quiet. Outside the small windows, there was nothing but black sky and the faint suggestion of stars, that particular kind of darkness that exists only at 38,000 feet, suspended between earth and heaven with nothing but thin metal and faith keeping you aloft. Arya slept on, her small hand still gripping Matteo's sweater like an anchor, her breathing deep and even. The transformation from screaming infant to peacefully sleeping baby seemed almost miraculous, and Juliana found herself unable to stop staring at this stranger holding her daughter with such natural ease. She noticed details now that panic had prevented her from seeing before. The way Matteo's thumb traced absent circles on Arya's back, an unconscious gesture that spoke of practiced fatherhood and muscle memory that ran deeper than thought. The slight stubble on his jaw that suggested he had been traveling for more than a day. The faint shadows under his eyes that matched her own, that particular exhaustion that came not from a single sleepless night, but from months of accumulated fatigue. Across the aisle, Luca had curled up in the window seat again, the stuffed lion tucked under his chin, but his eyes were still open, watching his father with an expression that seemed too old for his young face. There was something protective in the way he watched, as if he was making sure his papa was okay, as if their roles had reversed somewhere along the way and the child had become the guardian of the parent. Juliana recognized that look. She had seen it in photographs of herself as a teenager, after her father died and her mother retreated into grief for months. That premature awareness that the adult you depend on is fragile, breakable, human. Your wife, Juliana began carefully, then hesitated, unsure if she was crossing a line, intruding on grief too private to share with a stranger on a plane. I'm sorry, I don't mean to pry. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. Matteo was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Arya's sleeping face, his expression distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but steady, the voice of someone who had told this story enough times that the sharp edges had worn smooth, though the weight remained. Francesca, he said, and the name came out like a prayer, like something sacred that hurt to say but hurt more to keep silent. She died 18 months ago. Cancer. She fought it for 2 years, through the pregnancy, through Luca's early years. She was so stubborn, so determined that it wouldn't beat her, that she would be there to watch him grow up. He paused, swallowing hard, and Juliana saw his jaw tighten with the effort of keeping his composure. She made me promise, in those last weeks when we both knew there wasn't going to be a miracle, that I wouldn't let grief turn me into a ghost. That I would keep living, keep singing to our son even when my voice broke, keep making pancakes on Sunday mornings and reading bedtime stories, and doing all the normal things that would remind him the world was still good despite losing her. Juliana felt tears burning behind her eyes, her throat tight with empathy and recognition. I'm so sorry, Matteo. That's unimaginable. I can't even begin to understand what that must have been like. And you? Matteo asked gently, turning to look at her fully, his dark eyes searching her face with careful attention. Aria's father? There it was. The question she had been dreading, the shame she carried like a stone in her chest, the failure that felt so much worse than widowhood because at least death was beyond anyone's control. Abandonment was a choice, a deliberate rejection, a walking away that said you weren't worth staying for. Juliana looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap, the wedding ring she still wore on her right hand because she couldn't bring herself to take it off completely but couldn't bear to keep it where Marco had placed it. His name is Marco. He left when Aria was 3 months old. Just vanished one day while I was at the doctor with her for a checkup. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like water breaking through a dam that had been holding for too long. I came home and the apartment was different. Emptier. His clothes were gone from the closet. His shoes weren't by the door. His toothbrush wasn't in the bathroom. It took me almost an hour to accept what I was seeing, to understand that he had actually left while we were gone, that he had planned it, packed his things, walked out without saying goodbye. Matteo's expression hardened, something fierce and protective flashing in his eyes. He didn't even have the courage to face you? To explain? He left a note, Juliana said, her voice bitter now, edged with anger that she usually tried to suppress because it felt unproductive, indulgent, beneath her. On the kitchen counter, next to the coffee maker we bought together when we first moved into that apartment. It said, I can't do this. I'm not strong enough to be what you both need. That was it. No explanation. No apology. No forwarding address or phone number. Just those 2 sentences and then nothing. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, frustrated by the tears that kept coming despite her determination to be stronger than this, better than this. I spent months trying to understand it, wondering what I did wrong, how I failed him, how I failed us. My family back in Italy kept calling, telling me to come home, that I couldn't raise a baby alone in America, that I needed to be with family. But I couldn't leave. Coming home felt like admitting defeat, like proving that Marco was right to leave, because I really wasn't strong enough to do this on my own. You didn't fail anyone, Matteo said, and there was steel in his voice now, a firmness that cut through Juliana's spiral of self-blame. He failed you. He failed his daughter. Walking away like that, without explanation or support, that's not weakness. That's cowardice. And you choosing to stay, to keep going despite everything, that's not defeat. That's strength. The words settled over Juliana like a blanket, warm and unexpected. She had been telling herself for 6 months that she was strong, that she could handle this, that she didn't need Marco or anyone else. But hearing it from someone else, from this stranger who understood what it meant to parent alone, carried a weight that her own internal affirmations never had. Is that where you're coming from? Juliana asked, needing to shift the focus away from her own pain, to understand this man who had appeared in her life at exactly the moment she needed him most. Italy. Matteo nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the window where darkness still pressed against the glass. My father's funeral. He died 2 weeks ago. Heart attack. Sudden. He was making espresso in the kitchen one morning and just collapsed. My mother found him 20 minutes later when she came downstairs. I'm so sorry, Juliana whispered, the inadequacy of the words painfully apparent. That's terrible. Were you close? No, Matteo said simply, and there was a complexity in that single syllable that spoke of years of complicated history. We weren't close. He never understood why I stayed in America after Francesca died. He thought I should bring Luca home to Italy, to family, to the village where I grew up. He couldn't accept that Francesca's parents are in Brooklyn, that they're Luca's connection to his mother, that Luca's entire support system is there. His school, his friends, his therapist who has helped him process losing his mama. Matteo's hand continued its gentle pattern on Aria's back, that unconscious soothing motion that never stopped. My father and I argued about it constantly. Every phone call ended in a fight. He said I was being selfish, that I was depriving Luca of his heritage, his culture, his Italian family. But he didn't understand that sometimes staying where the grief happened is the only way to heal from it. Running away doesn't make it hurt less. It just means you're hurt and alone in a place that doesn't feel like home. Juliana understood this more than she could articulate. It was exactly why she had stayed in New York despite her family's pleas, despite the loneliness, despite how much easier it would have been to go back to Rome where her mother could help with Aria, where she wouldn't have to navigate motherhood in a language that still sometimes felt foreign on her tongue. Where in Brooklyn, she asked, curious now about this life he was describing, this world she had never been part of but could somehow envision clearly through his words. Carroll Gardens, Matteo said, and a small smile touched his lips for the first time since he had mentioned Francesca's death. We have a small apartment above my family's old restaurant. Trattoria Bianco. Francesca's parents run it now. Her father, Sal, is the chef. Her mother, Rosa, manages everything else. It's chaotic. Loud. The kitchen is always producing too much food and Rosa is always trying to feed everyone who walks through the door whether they're hungry or not. His smile grew slightly wider, more genuine. It smells like garlic and basil and fresh bread all day, every day. Sometimes I wake up at 3 in the morning and I can smell whatever Sal is prepping for the lunch service. Luca complains that his clothes always smell like restaurant, that the other kids at school can tell what we had for dinner the night before just by standing next to him. That sounds beautiful, Juliana said wistfully, imagining this warm, noisy, loving chaos that was so different from the quiet isolation of her studio apartment in Queens. Like a real home. A real family. It is, Matteo agreed. It's not what I imagined my life would look like. When Francesca and I moved to New York, we had plans. I was going to work in kitchens, learn from the best chefs, eventually open my own place. Something modern, innovative, the kind of restaurant that gets written up in magazines. Francesca was going to be a photographer, do editorial work, travel for assignments. He looked down at Aria again, his expression soft with a sadness that had nothing to do with regret and everything to do with roads not taken. Cancer stole those dreams. Stole a lot of things. But it couldn't steal everything. We still have the restaurant, even if it's not the one I imagined. Luca still has his nanny, even if he doesn't have his mother. And I still get to cook, even if it's Sunday gravy instead of deconstructed molecular gastronomy. Your father never understood that? Juliana asked. He thought I was settling. Giving up. He couldn't see that sometimes the life you build from the pieces of broken dreams is more valuable than the perfect life you planned. Matteo's voice carried no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance born from hard-won wisdom. He died thinking I had wasted my potential, that I should have come home after Francesca died instead of staying in America playing house above a restaurant. This was Luca's first time meeting him, Matteo continued after a pause. My father. His nonno. We flew to Italy for the funeral and Luca spent 3 days in a house with relatives he had never met, speaking a language he barely understands because we speak mostly English at home, surrounded by people crying over a man he never knew. He kept asking me why everyone was so sad about someone who never came to visit us, who never sent birthday presents, who never called to ask how he was doing. Matteo's voice cracked slightly on the last words, and Juliana saw him swallow hard, fighting for composure. I didn't have a good answer for him. How do you explain complicated family relationships to a 6-year-old? How do you tell your son that sometimes people show love poorly or not at all, but it doesn't mean they didn't care in their own broken way? I don't know, Juliana said honestly. I don't know how to explain any of this to Aria when she's old enough to ask about her father. How do I tell her that he left because he wasn't strong enough? That his weakness had nothing to do with her worth? How do I make sure she doesn't grow up thinking she wasn't good enough to make him stay? They sat in silence for a moment, two strangers bound by parallel struggles, by the weight of raising children alone, by grief and abandonment, and the daily work of staying upright when everything in you wants to collapse. Then Matteo spoke again, his voice quiet but certain. My mother used to say, before she died when I was 15, that we can't make people strong enough to stay. We can only choose to be strong enough ourselves. That strength isn't about never breaking. It's about what we do after we break. Whether we stay in pieces or whether we put ourselves back together, even if the cracks still show. Your mother sounds like she was wise, Juliana said. She was, Matteo agreed. Francesca reminded me of her in a lot of ways. That same fierce determination to find light in dark places. That refusal to let hard things make her hard. Even when the cancer was winning, even when we both knew she was dying, she insisted on joy. On making Luca laugh. On dancing in the kitchen to terrible pop music. On leaving us with memories of her living instead of just memories of her dying. He looked at Juliana directly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. This little one, your Arya, she has that same fighting spirit. I can feel it. The way she cried, that wasn't weakness or bad behavior. That was her refusing to settle for less than what she needed. She demanded that someone understand, that someone show up, that someone see her distress and do something about it. How can you tell all that from a crying baby? Juliana asked, half skeptical, half desperate to believe him. Because she didn't give up, Matteo said simply. She could have worn herself out and gone to sleep exhausted and defeated. But she kept crying, kept demanding, kept insisting that the world pay attention. That's not weakness. That's knowing your own worth. That's refusing to accept being invisible or unheard. He shifted slightly, adjusting his hold on Arya without waking her. Just like her mother, who got on a plane alone with a baby, who traveled across an ocean despite being exhausted and scared and overwhelmed, who refused to let anyone make her feel small for struggling. You could have given up. Gone back to Italy like your family wanted. Let Marco's leaving define you as a failure. But you didn't. You stayed. You're still here. Still fighting. The words cracked something open in Juliana's chest, something that had been locked tight since the morning she found Marco's note. When was the last time someone had seen her strength instead of her struggle? When was the last time someone had acknowledged that staying was harder than leaving, that showing up every day despite the exhaustion and fear and overwhelming responsibility was an act of courage rather than just the bare minimum of acceptable parenting? Why did you help me? Juliana asked, the question that had been circling in her mind since the moment Matteo stood up. Really? You could have just put in headphones like everyone else. Let the flight attendant handle it. Stayed in your seat and minded your own business. Why did you get involved? Matteo was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, lost in memory. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost reverent. Because 18 months ago, I was on a flight back from Francesca's funeral, bringing her ashes home to New York because she wanted to be scattered in Prospect Park where we got married, not buried in Italy where she had never lived. Luca was screaming. Just inconsolable. Grief-stricken, crying that he was too young to understand, but old enough to feel in every cell of his body. He paused, and Juliana saw his throat work as he swallowed against emotion. I didn't know what to do. I was barely holding myself together. I hadn't slept in days. I couldn't eat. I couldn't think. And Luca was screaming, and everyone on the plane was staring and judging, and I was convinced I was failing him, that Francesca had been wrong to make me promise to keep going because clearly I wasn't capable of doing this alone. Matteo's hand stilled on Arya's back, just for a moment, before resuming its gentle circles. Then this grandmother, she must have been 75, 80 years old, from the seat behind me, she stood up and took Luca from my arms without asking. Just lifted him up, sat back down with him in her lap, and started singing. Some old Italian lullaby I had never heard before. And Luca stopped crying. Just like Arya did. Just completely stopped and fell asleep against this stranger's chest. What did you do? Juliana whispered. I cried, Matteo said simply. Just sat there and sobbed like a child while this old woman held my son and told me, in Italian, that I wasn't alone. That grief makes us feel isolated, but we're surrounded by people who understand loss, who have survived it, who will help us survive it too if we let them. She said the only way through is together. That we weren't meant to carry this alone, no matter how much we convince ourselves we have to. He looked at Juliana again, and she saw tears shining in his eyes that he didn't try to hide. She held Luca for the rest of that flight. 7 hours. Let me sleep for the first time in a week. And when we landed, she gave me her phone number and told me to call if I ever needed anything. A meal delivered. Someone to watch Luca for an hour. Just a voice on the phone to remind me I wasn't alone. Did you call her? Juliana asked. 3 times in the first month, Matteo admitted. She brought soup. Sat with Luca while I went to the grocery store alone. Let me talk about Francesca without trying to fix anything or tell me it would get better. She just listened and understood and stayed. He reached into his pocket with his free hand, careful not to disturb Arya, and pulled out a napkin and a pen. Her name was Margaret. She died 6 months ago. peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her family. Her daughter called to tell me, to let me know because Margaret had talked about Luca and me, had kept our photo on her refrigerator. At her funeral, her daughter told me that helping us helped her mother too. That she had lost her own husband a year before that flight, that she was traveling back from visiting his grave, that holding Luca reminded her that grief doesn't have to be the end of connection. That we can still help each other even when we're broken. Matteo started writing something on the napkin, his handwriting cramped, but legible in the dim light. Margaret taught me that the kindness we receive has to be passed forward. That we honor the people who help us by helping others. So when I saw you struggling, when I heard Arya crying and saw your exhaustion and shame, I couldn't not help. Because Margaret helped me. Because someone has to break the cycle of isolation that grief creates. Because we're better together than we are alone, even if we're just together for a few hours on a plane. He finished writing and folded the napkin carefully, then pressed it into Giuliana's hand with a gentleness that made her chest ache. That's the address of the Trattoria in Brooklyn. Trattoria Bianco, Carroll Gardens. If you ever need anything, and I mean anything at all, you come there. A meal when you're too tired to cook. Someone to hold Arya while you eat with both hands. A place to sit with other people so you remember what adult conversation feels like. Just a reminder that you're not alone in this, even when it feels like you are. Giuliana looked down at the napkin in her hand, at the address written in Matteo's careful script, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But maybe the possibility of hope. The recognition that connection was possible even in the midst of grief and exhaustion and overwhelming responsibility. That she didn't have to do this completely alone. That asking for help wasn't weakness, but wisdom. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words carried the weight of everything she couldn't articulate. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for not judging. Thank you for showing me that strength can be borrowed when your own runs out. Thank you for staying when you could have looked away. We stay, remember?" Matteo said softly. "That's what we do. We stay. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Because that's what our children need to see. Not perfection. Not fearlessness. Just people who keep showing up, who keep trying, who keep choosing love even when love hurts." Outside the window, the first hints of dawn were beginning to paint the horizon in shades of pink and gold. They had been talking for hours, Giuliana realized, the entire night passing in conversation that felt both impossibly intimate and entirely natural. The way it sometimes does when you meet someone who understands something essential about your life that most people can't see. The flight attendants were beginning to move through the cabin, raising window shades, preparing for descent into New York. The businessman in 20D was stirring, checking his phone. The woman in 22B was gathering her things. All around them, the ordinary rituals of ending a flight were beginning, and Giuliana felt a sudden panic that this connection, this moment, would end when they landed and she would be alone again. Matteo seemed to sense her thoughts. "It doesn't end here," he said quietly. "That address is real. The invitation is real. I meant what I said. Come by the restaurant. Anytime. We eat family dinner every Sunday at 4. Rosa makes enough food for 20 people even though it's usually just the 6 of us. There's always room for 2 more. 6? Giuliana asked. Rosa and Sal. Luca and me. And Francesca's younger sister, Maria, and her husband, Tony. They live upstairs too. It's cramped and loud and chaotic and nobody has any privacy. But it's family. It's people who show up for each other. And you're welcome there. Both of you." The plane began its descent, the engines changing pitch, the slight pressure change making Giuliana's ears pop. Matteo carefully, reluctantly, began to transfer Arya back to Giuliana's arms. The baby stirred slightly but didn't wake, settling against her mother's chest with the same peaceful expression she had worn against Matteo's. Giuliana felt the warmth of her daughter's small body, the weight of her in a way she hadn't noticed before. Not a burden but a presence. Not something to be endured but someone to be cherished. The shift in perspective was subtle but profound, and she knew it had everything to do with the man sitting beside her who had shown her that struggle didn't equal failure, that needing help didn't mean weakness, that staying was its own form of victory. As the plane touched down on the runway, as the familiar thump and screech of landing jarred through the cabin, Giuliana clutched the napkin in her hand and made a silent promise to herself. She would go to that restaurant. Maybe not today. Maybe not next week. But she would go. She would accept the help being offered. She would allow herself to be part of a community again instead of isolated in her grief and shame. She would choose to stay, but she would stop trying to stay alone. 9 months later, Juliana stood on a tree-lined street in Carroll Gardens, staring at a red awning that read Trattoria Bianco in faded but cheerful letters. Through the large front windows, she could see families eating, could hear the clatter of dishes and bursts of laughter that spoke of a place well-loved and lived in. The late afternoon sun painted everything in warm gold, and somewhere inside, she could smell garlic and basil and fresh bread, exactly as Matteo had described. 9 months. 37 weeks. 259 days. That was how long she had carried Matteo's napkin in her wallet, creased and worn from being folded and unfolded countless times in moments of weakness and longing. How long she had thought about walking through that door but couldn't find the courage. How long she had convinced herself that the connection she felt on that flight was one-sided, that Matteo had simply been kind to a stranger and moved on with his life, that showing up now would be desperate and pathetic and would only prove what she had feared all along, that she wasn't worth staying for. But in those 9 months, everything had changed. Arya had learned to crawl, pulling herself across the floor of their small apartment with determination that both delighted and exhausted Juliana. Then she learned to pull herself up on furniture, standing on wobbly legs with a triumphant expression that made Juliana's heart swell. Then came the first steps, tentative and unsteady, across the 3 feet between the couch and the coffee table on a Tuesday afternoon in April that Juliana had marked in her calendar like a national holiday. Arya had said "Mama" for the first time, that precious word that made all the sleepless nights and exhausting days worth it. She had discovered a love of music, swaying and bouncing whenever Juliana played anything with a beat, her face lighting up with pure joy in a way that reminded Juliana that happiness was still possible, still accessible, still worth pursuing. And through it all, Juliana had carried that napkin. Had pulled it out on the hard days when isolation felt crushing and the weight of solo parenting seemed impossible. Had read the address until she had it memorized. Had Googled the restaurant and looked at photos of the exterior, trying to imagine herself walking through that door. Had started the journey a dozen times, getting as far as the subway platform before turning back, convinced she was making a mistake. But 3 days ago, something shifted. Juliana was changing Arya's diaper, singing absently while the baby kicked and squirmed, when Arya suddenly went still and started humming. Not random baby sounds, but an actual melody. The Neapolitan lullaby. The one Matteo had sung on the plane. Juliana had frozen, her hands stilling on the diaper tabs, her breath caught in her throat. "What was that, Stelina? Can you do it again?" Arya had hummed it again, clearer this time, her eyes bright and focused on her mother's face. And then she said, clear as a bell, a new word that Juliana had never taught her, Teo. Not Matteo. Just Teo. And Juliana knew, with absolute certainty, that it was time. That whatever fear was holding her back, whatever shame or insecurity or self-protection, it was keeping her from something important. That Arya remembered. That the connection wasn't one-sided. That some things were worth the risk of being vulnerable, of asking for what you need, of showing up even when you're terrified of rejection. So here she stood, on a Sunday afternoon at 3:45, with Arya balanced on her hip, the baby's small hand gripping her shirt, both of them dressed in their nicest clothes like they were going somewhere important. Because they were. They were choosing connection over isolation. They were choosing community over independence. They were choosing to believe that the invitation had been real, that the welcome would be genuine, that showing up was brave rather than desperate. Juliana took a deep breath, adjusted her grip on Arya, and pushed through the door. The restaurant was exactly as she had imagined, but somehow more. The noise hit her first, a wall of sound that was overwhelming and welcoming in equal measure. Conversations in Italian and English, and that beautiful hybrid of both. The clatter of plates and silverware. Laughter from a corner table where an extended family was celebrating something, their voices rising in a toast. The hiss and sizzle from the kitchen where someone was working the stove. Red-checked tablecloths covered every table. Wine bottles lined the walls, some clearly decorative, others half-empty and waiting to be finished. Photographs covered every available surface, black and white images of Italy mixed with color photos of family gatherings, of children growing up, of moments captured and preserved. The air was thick with the smell of Sunday gravy, that long-simmered tomato sauce that Juliana's own grandmother used to make, rich with meat and garlic and patience. And then she saw him. Matteo stood near the kitchen, holding a large tray loaded with pasta dishes, his head thrown back in laughter at something an elderly woman beside him was saying. He looked different than he had on the plane. Less exhausted. His hair was slightly longer, curling at his collar in a way that made him look younger. He wore a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, an apron tied around his waist that was splattered with sauce, and he looked like someone who had learned to live again instead of just survive. The elderly woman, Rosa, Juliana guessed, was gesturing wildly with her hands as she talked, her face animated and expressive in that particularly Italian way. She was small and round, with gray hair pulled back in a bun, and she wore an apron that matched Matteo's, though hers was cleaner, suggesting she was management rather than kitchen staff. Juliana stood frozen in the doorway, second-guessing everything, ready to turn around and leave before anyone noticed her. But then Luca spotted them. "Papa! Papa!" His voice cut through the dinner noise like a bell, high and excited and filled with genuine joy. "It's the airplane lady! And she brought Aria." The entire restaurant seemed to pause. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. A dozen sets of eyes swiveled to the doorway where Juliana stood with Aria, feeling exposed and vulnerable and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Matteo froze, the tray of pasta forgotten in his hands. His eyes found Juliana's across the crowded room, and the expression on his face, shock and joy and disbelief and hope all crashing together, told her everything she needed to know. She wasn't wrong. She hadn't imagined it. The connection had been real. Luca rushed toward them, no longer the sleepy 6-year-old from the plane, but a vibrant, energetic child who looked like he had grown several inches in 9 months. He still clutched the stuffed lion, Juliana noticed, though it was more worn now, more loved, the fur matted in places where it had been held tight through hard nights. "You came," Luca said, bouncing on his toes in front of them. "Papa talks about you all the time. He tells everyone about how you were on the plane and Aria was crying and he sang to her and she stopped. He says you and Aria are his friends from the sky and that someday you would come visit and here you are." "Luca," Matteo said, suddenly beside them, his voice gentle but firm, though Juliana could hear the tremor in it, the emotion he was trying to control. He set the tray down on a nearby table without looking, his eyes never leaving her face. "Give them some space, Figlio. Let them breathe." But Aria had other plans. The moment she saw Matteo, her entire body went rigid with recognition and excitement. She reached for him with both hands, bouncing in Juliana's arms, making the insistent demanding sounds that meant she wanted something immediately. "Teo," she said clearly, proudly, like she had been practicing. "Teo, Teo, Teo." Matteo's eyes went wide, his mouth opening in shock. "She knows my name. She remembers." "She's been humming your lullaby for 3 months, Juliana said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to sound calm and collected. "I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, that babies just make sounds that sometimes seem like melodies. But then 3 days ago she said your name. Just said it out of nowhere while I was changing her diaper. And I knew we had to come. That I couldn't keep carrying your napkin around pretending I was going to throw it away. That this was real and I needed to stop being afraid of it." Matteo knelt down so he was eye level with Aria, and Juliana saw that his hands were trembling slightly. "Ciao, Stellina," he said softly, using the same endearment he had used on the plane, and Juliana's heart clenched because he remembered too. 9 months and he still remembered. Aria lunged from Juliana's arms into Matteo's, wrapping her small arms around his neck with the absolute trust that only babies possess, the kind of trust that says you are safe, you are good, you are exactly what I needed. Matteo caught her easily, standing with her held close, and Juliana saw tears shining in his eyes that he didn't try to hide. "I hoped you would come," he whispered, looking at Juliana over Aria's head, his voice rough with emotion. "Every day for 9 months, I hoped. But I didn't want to pressure you. Didn't want to assume that what I felt that night was something you felt too. Didn't want to make you uncomfortable or obligated. So I just hoped. And told myself that if it was meant to happen, you would find your way here when you were ready." "It was real," Juliana said, and suddenly she was crying too, tears streaming down her face in the middle of this crowded restaurant with dozens of people watching. "It is real. I was just scared. Scared that I was reading too much into kindness. Scared that showing up would prove I was desperate and alone and exactly as pathetic as I felt. Scared that you had forgotten, that the connection was one-sided, that I was clinging to a moment that meant everything to me but was just another day for you." "Just another day?" Mateo repeated, and he laughed, though it came out more like a sob. Juliana, I have thought about you every single day since that flight. Wondered if you were okay. If Arya was healthy. If you had found support or if you were still struggling alone. I told everyone about you. Asked them to pray for you even though I didn't know if you were religious. Hoped that the universe or God or whatever force governs these things would keep you safe until you found your way back to us. Rosa appeared beside Mateo, her face soft with understanding and welcome. She gently took Arya from his arms, speaking to the baby in rapid Italian that made Arya giggle and reach for Rosa's necklace. Che bella bambina. So beautiful. Come, little one, let Nonna Rosa show you the kitchen. We have so many things to see, so much food to taste. Luca immediately grabbed Arya's hand, his face serious with responsibility. I'll help, Nonna. I'll make sure she doesn't touch the stove or pull things off the counter. Papa taught me how to be safe in the kitchen. Rosa smiled and led both children toward the back, speaking in that soothing mixture of Italian and English that seemed designed to make children feel cherished and important. Which left Juliana and Mateo standing in the middle of the busy restaurant, the noise and chaos flowing around them like water around stones, creating a pocket of stillness in the midst of movement. I don't want to do this alone anymore, Mateo said quietly, intensely, his voice low enough that only she could hear over the ambient noise. Not the grief. Not the joy. Not the beautiful, terrifying work of raising children in a world that doesn't make it easy. Francesca told me not to become a ghost, not to let loss turn me into someone who just goes through the motions. You showed me what it means to stay alive instead of just staying functional. Juliana stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to smell the faint scent of basil and garlic that clung to his clothes. Marco's last words in that note were that he wasn't strong enough to be what we needed. I spent months thinking he meant I needed to find someone to help raise Arya, someone to split the responsibility. But you made me realize what he actually meant. That he knew I needed someone who understood that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about staying even when you're broken. About choosing to show up every day even when every day feels impossible. We're both broken, Mateo said, and it wasn't a complaint or a confession, but simply a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of shared reality. Then maybe we can figure out how to stay together, Juliana said. To build something from the pieces. Not to fix each other or complete each other, or any of that romantic nonsense that pretends love makes everything easy. But to hold each other up when holding ourselves up gets too hard. To remember that we're not alone even when loneliness is overwhelming. To choose each other every day, the way we choose to stay for our children. Mateo reached out and took her hand, his palm warm and calloused and solid, and it felt like coming home. Like finding something she hadn't known she was looking for. Like the possibility that broken things could be beautiful, that loss didn't have to be the end of connection, that family could be chosen and built and cherished just as much as the family you were born into. Come, he said, leading her toward the back corner of the restaurant. There's a table. Francesca's favorite spot. Rosa keeps it reserved on Sundays for family dinner. You're family now. Both of you. If you want to be. They sat at the corner table, a round one covered in the same red-checked cloth as all the others, but positioned where you could see the whole restaurant, where the kitchen door swung open every few minutes releasing bursts of heat and cooking smells. Luca and Arya were on the floor nearby, building towers out of sugar packets and breadsticks, the toddler knocking them down with delighted shrieks of, "Oh," while Luca patiently rebuilt them with the long-suffering expression of an older sibling already. Rosa brought food without asking what they wanted. Plate after plate appeared on the table. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven. A caprese salad with tomatoes that tasted like summer. Pasta carbonara that was creamy and perfect. Chicken parmigiana that fell apart at the touch of a fork. Roasted vegetables that had been kissed with olive oil and salt. A bottle of red wine that Rosa poured for both of them with a knowing smile and a pat on Juliana's shoulder that said, "Welcome, we've been waiting for you." Juliana watched the children playing, watched Mateo cut bread and serve food with practiced ease, watched the way other diners looked over at their table with warm smiles that suggested they knew something important was happening here. She thought about the past 9 months. About every hard day she had survived alone. About every moment she had pulled out that napkin and wondered if she was brave enough to use it. About the slow journey from shame to strength, from isolation to the possibility of connection. "Is this crazy?" she asked quietly, setting down her fork and looking at Mateo with eyes that held every fear she couldn't quite suppress. "We barely know each other. One conversation on a plane and 9 months of silence, and now we're sitting here talking about family and staying and building something together. People don't do this. This isn't how life works. We know the most important things, Matteo countered, his voice calm and certain in a way that steadied something anxious in Juliana's chest. We know what it means to survive. To stay when running would be easier. To keep singing even when our voices break. To choose love and responsibility over comfort and escape. We know what it takes to put children's needs ahead of our own exhaustion. We know how to keep going when everything in us wants to give up. He reached across the table and took her hand again, his thumb tracing circles on her palm the same way he had traced them on Aria's back. What else do we really need to know? The rest is just details. Favorite foods and pet peeves and childhood stories. That's the easy part. The foundation is already there. We're both people who stay. Who show up. Who choose the hard thing because it's the right thing. Everything else we can figure out together. What if we fail? Juliana whispered, the question that had been haunting her since the moment she decided to walk through that door. Then we fail together, Matteo said simply. But I don't think we will. Look at them. He gestured to where Luca was showing Aria how to stack the sugar packets more carefully, his hands guiding hers with patient gentleness. The baby was watching him with complete focus, trying to copy his movements, succeeding sometimes and failing others, but clearly delighted by the whole enterprise. When a tower fell, they both dissolved into giggles, and Luca would say, again, and they would start over with undiminished enthusiasm. They already know something we're still learning, Matteo said softly. What's that? That family isn't about biology or perfect timing or ideal circumstances. It's about who stays. Who shows up. Who chooses you every single day, even when every day is hard. Especially when every day is hard. They know we belong together. Maybe we should trust them. Aria toddled over to the table then, her steps still wobbly and uncertain but determined. She climbed into Juliana's lap, then immediately reached for Matteo, clearly wanting them both. Luca followed, pressing against his father's side, looking up at Juliana with shy but hopeful eyes. Are you going to stay now? Luca asked, his voice small but clear. Are you going to be like us? Are we going to be a family? Juliana looked at Matteo, saw the hope and fear and vulnerability in his eyes that probably matched her own. She thought about Marco's note, about those words that had haunted her for so long. I'm not strong enough to be what you both need. She finally understood what he meant. Not that she needed someone to complete her or fix her or make her whole, but that she needed someone who would recognize and honor her strength, who would match it with their own, who would stand beside her instead of requiring her to hold them up. She looked at Aria, content and safe in her arms, reaching for Matteo like he belonged to them. She looked at Luca, waiting for an answer with the earnest patience of a child who has already lost too much and is brave enough to hope anyway. She looked at Matteo and saw not a rescue or a solution but a partner. An equal. Someone as broken and strong and determined as she was. Someone who would stay. Yes, she said, and the word felt like a promise, like a vow, like the beginning of something that had actually started 9 months ago on a plane over the Atlantic. We're going to be a family. Aria pointed at the four of them, her small finger moving from Juliana to Matteo to Luca to herself, and said with absolute certainty her newest word, probably taught by Rosa in the kitchen, famiglia. Family. Matteo reached across the table, past the plates of food and glasses of wine, and took Juliana's hand. This time, neither of them let go. They sat like that as Rosa brought more food, as other diners smiled and raised glasses in their direction, as Luca chattered about his school and his friends and all the things he wanted to show Aria. They sat as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows painting everything gold, as the restaurant filled with the sounds of family and laughter and life continuing despite loss, because of loss, in defiance of everything that tried to break them. They sat and chose each other. Chose staying. Chose the hard, beautiful work of building family from broken pieces. Chose to believe that sometimes the most important connections happen in the most unlikely places, that sometimes strangers become family, that sometimes the path forward isn't about forgetting the past, but about carrying it with you into something new. And in that moment, in that crowded restaurant in Brooklyn with its red-checked tablecloths and smell of garlic and walls covered in photographs of other families who had gathered here before them, Juliana finally understood what it meant to come home. Not to a place. Not to the past. But to people. To the ones who stay. To the ones who see your broken pieces and stay anyway. To the ones who understand that strength isn't about never needing help, but about having the courage to accept it when it's offered. She squeezed Mateo's hand, and he squeezed back, and somewhere in that simple gesture was a promise. Not of perfection or ease or happily ever after, but of showing up, of staying, of choosing each other and their children every single day, even when days are hard, especially when days are hard. Famiglia. The word echoed in Juliana's heart as they sat together, as they shared food and stories, and the beginning of something that looked like hope. The word that meant family, home, belonging. The word that meant she wasn't alone anymore. None of them were. They had found their way back to each other, and this time, they were staying.